One thing that you can add within that headline is if you have hit a rank or a chart in some way. The reason that we would do something like that is to show new listeners that you're not just a flash in the pan kind of podcast. You've been doing it for a while. You have achieved things and other people are listening. So it kind of creates a little bit of fear of missing out for the person who is looking at your podcast description. Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. What is the first thing that you look at when you are discovering a new podcast? Is it the episode titles? Is it the cover art? What is the first thing that you're going to try to figure out what in the world is this podcast about? Now, you probably answered the description. Your podcast description is probably one of the most important parts of your podcast details. It is imperative that when you are putting all of this information together, when you're launching your podcast or maybe revisiting your podcast description, that you are very clear who your podcast is for, what the podcast listeners can expect, and where to connect with you further. That last one is one that I see a lot of people miss. So we're going to talk through how to write a good podcast description, when you should probably look at updating your description. We're going to talk through some templates as well as some examples. But before we get into that, I want to go through what the difference is between a podcast description and your show notes. This is something that I've found people asking. I'm in the podcasting space, so I don't ever really think that people don't understand the difference, but they do. So the podcast description is the space where you are summarizing the who, what, why of your show. It helps potential listeners determine if your show is for them and explains the topic of your show in a very concise and very to the point kind of way. Now, your show notes, those are going to be specific to each episode, and that is going to give your audience an idea of what each of the episodes is about, but is not as overarching as your podcast description. Let's talk through when you should update your podcast description. If you're a new podcaster, then you're going to want to make sure that you get this right the first time. But if you've been podcasting for a while and you're ready to kind of tweak it, maybe you have shifted your audience a little bit, maybe you are finding that your content has shifted slightly or you went through a rebrand. All of those are great reasons to look at your podcast description and find ways to adjust it. I think that it's important to check every 6 months to every year just to make sure that there's nothing in there that you don't want. And it allows you to find any spaces where you might want to shift any of the language that you're using in your description. So let's go through how to write a description for your podcast. First and foremost, you want to start with the headline. This usually includes the name of the show, your name, and very clearly and concisely what your podcast is about. For example, mine says, Listeners to Leads, hosted by Alicia Galati, teaches new and aspiring podcasters how to use their podcasts to grow their business. That encompasses exactly what my show is about. It lets people know the title of the show, who I am, and what the podcast is going to achieve for them. Another example, the Positively Living Podcast is a self-improvement podcast with specially curated content to support multi-passionate creatives and entrepreneurs. So this description gets right to the point of what the podcast is called, what the content is about, and who the content is for. One thing that you can add within that headline is if you have hit a rank or a chart in some way. So maybe you are the top 5% in productivity, or you have hit top 10% worldwide. Whatever it is, if there's some type of number that you want to shout to the rooftops about, that headline would be a great place to put that information. The reason that we would do something like that is to show new listeners that you're not just a flash in the pan kind of podcast. You've been doing it for a while. You have achieved things and other people are listening. So it kind of creates a little bit of fear of missing out for the person who is looking at your podcast description. Next, you're going to want to write a summary. This gives your listeners a brief overview of what your podcast is about. So it goes a little more in depth than your headline, but still gives a lot of valuable information on why this podcast is for this person. Here's an example from a podcast that is about empowering women to join C-suite level positions as well as boards. We aspire to share what is possible and encourage more women to leap, striving for these board and C-suite positions themselves to change the path towards a more inclusive future. This podcast will share stories on how women lead and how their leadership opens the doors for the greater value of opportunities for them. In that example, you could hear how there's even more depth to the podcast than just that headline of women who are looking for C-suite or board level positions. It shows the purpose and the mission behind the podcast. Another thing that I recommend putting in this section in the summary is about you. What are your credentials? Who are you? And why should your podcast listeners listen to you? You can share if you have degrees, if you are leading masterminds, if you've hit a certain financial goal that your listeners would be interested in. These are all things that you can add to further validate that these people should be listening to you and that you know what you're talking about. The third thing you're going to want to do is speak to the format of the show. Now, this lets potential listeners figure out how often your show is going to be available to them. Are you doing a limited series? Is it a seasonal show? So you're going like 12 episodes or 10 episodes per season. Do you share bite-sized episodes? Are there interviews that you're doing? Maybe it's a combination of some of those things. You want to let your audience know that within that part of your show description. An example of that would be, I share my experience, strength, and hope from 12-step recovery in each episode. They're all 20 minutes or less. Unlike most recovery podcasts where you hear a person's whole story, in this one, each episode is about a specific topic. So this shows very clearly that this podcast is different than some of the other podcasts that have to do with recovery, or in this case, 12-step recovery. Another example, each week, you'll hear about everything from refining your business vision, crafting relevant packages and services, intentional networking and marketing, and creating a magical client experience. Now, that one was for a web design and development business for women specifically in the tech space. So that gave a clear, this is every week. And these are some of the topics that we're going to talk about. It lets people know, are these things that I'm going to be interested in? The last thing you're going to want to do with your podcast description is to wrap up with a call to action. One of the go-to ones that we use for clients tends to be learn more about insert host name and insert podcast name at, and then we put the full website link within the description. At this point, I believe none of the podcast apps allow you to have hyperlinks within the description. So what this does is it allows people who are looking on whatever apps to easily copy and paste that into their browser if they're on their phone or if they're on their computer looking at your podcast description. Another thing that you can do is check out insert website for even more free infographics, tips, downloads, and masterclasses for insert whoever that person is that you would like to be listening to your show. Maybe it's business owners or coaches or moms, whatever it is, you want to be very clear and concise with where you want your podcast listeners to go to learn more about you. So here is a handy dandy and quick and dirty podcast description template that you can use. And we will have this in the show notes for you to look at, as well as on our website. So you can go to galatimedia.com/podcast and we will have the template there for you as well. Insert podcast title name, hosted by, insert host's full name, shows, teaches, helps, etc. And then insert the ideal listener. 2, then you're going to want to insert what you want them to get from your show. Your next part is going to be about yourself, why you should be speaking on these topics. The next section is going to be when episodes go live, if that's every week, every other week, once a month. You'll get episodes that talk about, and then you're going to want to share some of those general topics that are being discussed on your show. Then we move on to learn more about, insert host and podcast title, at insert podcast website. So here's a full example of that exact template in action. Listeners to Leads, hosted by Alicia Galati, teaches new and aspiring podcasters how to use their podcasts to grow their business. Alicia uses her experience as the owner of Galati Media, a full-service podcast management agency, to help business owners get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with their audiences through their podcasts. Alicia and her guests will discuss everything from launching a podcast to marketing a podcast. Learn more about Alicia and Listeners to Leads at www.listenerstoleads.com. So what that does is it very clearly lays out myself, who I am, why people should listen to me, the title of the podcast, who it's for, what people can learn, and that I have guests on my show and where they can go to get more information. Here are a few practical tips as you are coming up with your description. Remember that you should be as concise and to the point as possible. You don't want to have long paragraphs where you're going on and on and on and on. You want it to be easy for your audience to read and get to the point. You also want to include any relevant search terms that your audience would be searching for, because that'll help you show up in more searches. Make sure, like we said at the beginning, that you're updating your description when your content is changing, maybe the hosting is changing, or that target audience has changed a little bit. And the last tip is to not be afraid to use language that you would use in conversation to give your podcast description a little bit of flavor and a little bit of style, and to really show your personality where and when you can. All right. I hope that was helpful in helping you really get clear on how to write a good podcast description that is going to help your audience and your potential listeners decide that your podcast is right for them. If you have questions on this, or you maybe are having trouble finding the template, send me a DM on Instagram. I'm happy to send you the link or to chat about your description. All right. Have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.